Welcome to Potentiality, a space for big questions, deep conversations, and shared wisdom around the most important thing we do as human beings, which is how we parent and educate the next generation. My guest today has spent more than 4 decades in a rare conversation between the body and the mind. Professor Edward Monaghan, known to his students and community as Sifu Ed, is the co-founder of Ekata Training Center in Santa Clarita, California. He's a faculty member at UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, a certified mindfulness facilitator through UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center, and a martial artist of the highest order, holding 8 black belts across systems including Jeet Kune Do, Kung Fu, Savate, Muay Thai, and Qigong, with over 35 years as a professional in the health, fitness, and martial arts industries. He was inducted into the USA Martial Arts Hall of Fame and named Martial Arts Leader of the Year in 2010, voted one of America's top 100 trainers and among the top 5 in Los Angeles. And he has trained everyone from Hollywood's most recognized names to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department SWAT teams. And yet, what defines Sifu Ed most is his conviction that movement is not separate from awareness, that the body trained with intention becomes a doorway to presence, self-regulation, and wholeness, a belief he now brings to his research into movement-based awareness training for children and adults diagnosed with ADHD, ADD, and post-traumatic stress. Welcome to Potentiality, Ed. I've been so looking forward to our conversation today.
Oh, thank you, Elena. I'm really happy to be here and happy to be speaking with you.
Thank you so much. I want to start with your own story. You have been practicing martial arts for over 45 years, which means this path found you when you were very young. And I'd love us to begin there with the child who stepped onto the mat and what he was looking for, whether he knew it or not.
Well, um, I'm 64. I began this journey when I was quite young. And the beginning part of the process, I think what's relevant about that is recognizing that in the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a fascination with martial arts in the United States, um, largely due to Bruce Lee's influence,
Mm,
and um, and then there were fascinations with TV series Kung Fu with David Carradine, and this broader spectrum of sort of Saturday morning Kung Fu theater, where we saw all the crazy ninja movies of the 1970s. Um, but my attraction to this wasn't really born of a desire to be a part of that culture so much as it was a response to the type of people that I was hanging around. Um,
mm,
I grew up in Kentucky, and through no fault of my parents, chose to place myself in the most difficult circumstances possible. So, very early, I got into drug abuse and alcoholism and just a cacophony of poor choices. And that led me to hanging out with a bunch of people that were drug dealers and
mm,
dangerous people. So my desire was really based on self-preservation more so than anything else. And um, and that's what initiated the process. Now, that being said, I did still hold this fascination for the more mystic elements of the practice that were expressed in the film world, and that I think kind of held a fascination for a lot of different people. And and so that was always part of it. I was always fascinated with the philosophy,
mhm,
because there was an underlying practice. I think anytime, particularly in America, that we were viewing Asian cultures, there was a very different perspective through which I think we as Americans perceived what was occurring. And part of it was fictionalized, and part of it
Hmm.
was authentic, but um, but it was that undercurrent that really, as an adult, I recognized it was the core of which really came from the mindfulness practice. It came from this connection of the mind and the body, and that martial arts was used as a conduit for that to expand consciousness and expand awareness. So, there was my initial um, attraction was simply due to self-preservation, but there was also a fascination with the actual cultural element and the, I would say, the mysticism that sort of ran
Hmm.
behind that. Um, and that proved to be, gosh, as we get into the conversation more, I'll tell you more about that with my study of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and how that sort of merged into, uh, the work that I do now.
Thank you so much for sharing the story so vulnerably. And I think it says a lot why your path has shaped in the way it has. And I think the choices that you've made has really have shaped you into the expert that you are, because I've seen firsthand how you change the behavior of those youngsters who come to your center, especially those who the school gave up on and the parents gave up on. And I see the magic that you work, and I think the journey that you've been on, your personal journey, and what you've acquired through it, really explains why you can make a difference in the lives of those young people, where other adults appear to be helpless. I want to ask you, Ed, this always fascinates me. You've trained for over 12 years privately with Sifu Jerry Petit, one of Bruce Lee's original students, and I'd love to know what it means to receive knowledge that close to its source in a lineage that is very much alive rather than merely study the way most people do.
That's a very interesting question. We discussed that actually with our youth classes yesterday.
Mm.
Um, and the way that I phrase it to them, which places it in a very um, um, accessible context, is if you imagine that I asked them, how many of you guys have grandparents? And of course, they're kids, so they all raised their hand. And um, I said, well, that's what I want you to recognize about the martial art that you're studying and how close you are to the point of origin. That's a very unique distinction. I didn't really phrase it in that way with the kids, but that is a very unique distinction because a system founder in Cantonese is referred to as Sijo, and um, and Bruce Lee was Sijo Bruce, who was the system founder of Jeet Kune Do. And it's not technically a system; it's more of an approach. And then he taught his original students, and there were three subgroups, one group from Seattle, one group from Oakland, and then one group from LA. And the group from LA were the ones that were privy to the final evolution of what became Jeet Kune Do. And and Sifu Jerry was one of the primary students. He was the second student to join um, Sijo Lee's school in LA when he opened it up because he happened to be the second guy standing in line to fill out the paperwork. And um, and so, what I told the kids is, so Bruce Lee would be like my grandpa,
Mm.
and that's how close the lineage is. So I'm a second generation student. Uh,
Mm.
Sifu Jerry was a first generation student, which makes them third generation students because they're learning from me. Now, if you take that and really look historically at the root of a great deal of martial arts, and if we take the historical records, and they vary from culture to culture, but one of that's kind of the particular earmarks is the Shaolin Temple from central China. Um, that was it was found in about 100 CE, but the practice that is typically now associated with the modern practice, Shaolin Kung Fu, was about 500 CE,
Mm,
and that is multiple generations away. So, and it doesn't give a sense of real presence to,
mhm,
that's just sort of this long ago historical past that no one really relates to tangibly. But if you say, hey, it's your grandpa,
mhm,
then kids go, wow, that's pretty impressive that we're that close to it. And Bruce Lee was a seminal figure in the world of martial arts. Most people have an idea of him because of the films, but what they fail to recognize is he really became famous for essentially one film, which was Enter the Dragon, and that
mhm,
was the first joint production between uh, a Hollywood studio and a Chinese production company. So that completely changed the world of popular entertainment. But what he did in the world of martial arts completely changed the world of martial arts too, because he was considered really the father of modern mixed martial arts, which is the direction that everything has gone now. But what was significantly different is that um, while he emphasized practicality and individuality in with respect to one's own learning process and and creativity when it came to the individual being able to express themselves fully and completely through movement, um, he was um, he was a rigid disciplinarian, but was also this unique creative spirit. And um, so that was essentially unheard of at that time in the late 60s. So my teacher started training with him in 1967, and of course he died in 1973. But in that period of time, he changed so many people's lives. And what was really important to him was the philosophy. He
mhm,
wanted people to understand that. And that's one of the big departures in the modern world of MMA. It depends on where you go, but most of the MMA schools, it's all about fighting. And it's not about the evolution of the individual as a person who holds awareness and how that that creates a change in the way in which we interact with others. That's part of that original philosophy from more of the classical martial arts perspective, and which adheres more to the classical philosophy. And that's where I think the magic is when you can kind of integrate the um, the modern with the classical. And Sifu Jerry was he was brilliant at that because yeah, my appreciation for teachers, I have the greatest appreciation for those who make it appear very simple and natural.
mhm, mhm,
And when you would work with Jerry and you would talk with Jerry, he was so kind and so simple, but yet so profound with his observations because of his own exploration. And that's what I've always admired is that individual journey, that path that can be shared, but at the same time, not exactly copied because each individual's journey is their path to follow. And so that's what he was able to express without effort. And that's what made it so unique to be able to train with him. And both my wife and I had the opportunity to train with him extensively, and it was such a blessing. I mean, I was with him when he passed, along with uh, one of the other teachers and his wife, Sifu Fran Joseph, and she holds the mantle now of his association. So it's just to be tied that closely to it, that
Mhm.
connected. And of course, she's friends and we're friends with Shannon Lee and with Linda Lee Cadwell, um, Bruce Lee's family at the time. And I knew Brandon from another school called the Inosanto Academy. So Dan Inosanto, I trained with him. He was one of the original students as well. So just such a blessing to be able to train like that with those people for all that time and be able to convey that to others.
Mhm. That is such a unique and rare gift, I think, that you got, and now you're passing it down to your students. And I hope, and the fact that you're teaching them, right, how the distinction and how important it is for them to realize how close they're standing to the source because they're training with you. I think that's really, really important. And I want to go back to martial arts being more of a self-defense and physical fitness modality, which seems to be more what's known in the mainstream. And for you, it started for self-preservation. But as you alluded several times, Ed, there is the mysticism and the deeper philosophy that also fascinated you about it. And Bruce Lee really built Jeet Kune Do around the idea of absorbing what's useful and discarding what's not, right? Which itself is a really high philosophy, I feel like, of discernment,
Mm.
which I find to be so relevant in the modern world, particularly when it comes to youth. In the age of AI and exponential technologies, everything fabricated, the looks, the sounds, the stories. And knowing what's true, what's not has become really challenging, especially for those who don't have a life experience, who haven't developed their inner compass, their inner core. So drawing from your experience of martial arts and the decades of wisdom that you've acquired working with those prominent people. What do you see, or what is your way of helping children that you work with to develop that discernment capacity?
I'd say the number one characteristic is patience.
Mm,
Patience. And it goes hand in hand with the mindfulness philosophy of simply being present with what is rather than always looking for the next stimulation. And
mhm,
that's where I think we've run into an enormous problem with what we see in modern education and what we see with children because we're so oriented toward the result. If it's in the schools, you and I have talked about this extensively. If your sole purpose is to score well on a test, how is that applicable in the context of your broader scope of life? If it's just purely to be able to preserve funding for the school, that's not a very um, that's not a very efficient means by which we confer information that's going to allow for children to develop into whole people. And we're fighting this constant stimulation from the phones and the video games and the tablets that makes them addicted to a constant payoff, constant
mhm,
payoff, constant payoff. And I think that's the number one issue that we're having to negotiate right now. And the the larger issue is really helping parents to understand that it is completely fine to be bored. It is completely fine to take on a difficult task that requires arduous commitment and work to be able to achieve that goal. Because without that obstacle, you don't develop resilience. There's a scientist that I spoke with a few times named Andrew Huberman up in Stanford, who studies he studies a variety of things, but he's a neuroscientist and he
Hmm.
studies fear. And one of the things that he talks about is in studying people who regularly move through extraordinary circumstances that generate high levels of anxiety, uh, special operations, soldiers, people who are dealing with life and death decisions on a
Hmm.
somewhat daily basis. And and what seems to be characteristic of that is that they always go straight toward it. Whenever they experience that fear, the first thing they do is they go right toward what's most difficult.
Hmm.
And this is, and so teaching kids that it's okay for something to be hard, that it's okay to push, and using our body as, what we often say is that we're creating a state of manufactured conflict in a controlled environment. So when it comes to martial arts, um, we want to develop and expose kids to anxiety. We want them to deal with adversity. We want them to deal with pain. We want them to deal with, and and when we kind of go into this gentle, soft parenting world, those two things don't fit because, and usually there's a positive motivation from that. I mean, I think all of us who are parents, we don't want to repeat the mistakes that our parents made with us, and we don't want our children to experience pain. But unfortunately, without failure and pain, you don't develop any resilience, and then your ability to cope with life as it exists is severely limited. So when you create those circumstances externally on purpose, but in a controlled environment, you get a chance to practice managing fear, managing adversity, managing these difficulties, and you can come back to your breath. And we have a curriculum that's lined out for this, and one of them we have the ABCs of conflict avoidance, and B stands for be calm and breathe. And this was originally a portion of a curriculum that came from a gentleman named Dave Kovar up in Sacramento. It's a great curriculum. And but be calm and breathe, it carries an enormous weight with it because when we teach breathing techniques, we're touching the world of mindfulness. We're activating the parasympathetic nervous system. We're teaching kids to be able to manage the stress as it arises. We know that childhood anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, is one of the highest level of diagnoses that we see today, and 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 then we're seeing teenage levels of anxiety in children that are in kindergarten.
Hmm.
Why should you be anxious in kindergarten? There's absolutely no reason for
No
that
reason.
when you're
Hmm.
5. So we have to teach coping skills for that because I don't think we're likely to reverse society anytime soon. So, the only thing that we can do is work with the individual on how to manage the emotions that arise because of these stress levels, and then examine how we can mitigate the stress, and then on a relational level, um, teach kids how to manage communication styles effectively. Um, and it doesn't hurt if a lot of kids are very afraid of violent confrontations. We've been dealing with it for years with bullying, right? And it's an epidemic, truly. And um, and giving a kid um, a means by which they can not be a victim is extremely important. You give them verbal skills initially so that so they have a tool set they can work with. And then if those verbal skills, it can go from A to Z in 3 seconds, right? You might try your verbal skills, but then all of a sudden somebody's trying to take your head off. Well, having a skill set physically to be able to manage that that helps a lot in being able to being able to create a sense of comfort and self-confidence, and that's a big part of what we want to do with the kids. So I kind of went on a tangent there. Sorry about that, but I think it's related.
No, you did great because you touched upon several other questions that I wanted to ask. So I will try to weave them into our dialogue differently. But I want to thank you for speaking to the boredom because that's one thing that I try to work with, particularly when I coach youth, is the parents really don't give the space for boredom. I agree with you, but the youth also does not, they don't know how to, be with it, with that feeling. And the lack of understanding that actually creates space for creativity if you really know how to channel that energy. And so boredom, failure, there's so many things that we've made almost obsolete and trying to fill those things with something else. And we really took away the opportunities for kids to learn in the most natural way, rather than creating the controlled, safe environment for them to explore and fail safely, to be bored safely and figure out what to do with it. We're trying to substitute it with something that in the long run is not necessarily healthy for them. So thank you for speaking to all of that. As a mindfulness, yes, go ahead.
I just want to add one other piece. It comes back to what you were also saying about Bruce Lee's philosophy of take what is useful and disregard the rest.
Mhm.
What a lot of people miss with that general philosophy is that the way in which he taught was not just take a look at everything and throw it out the window if it doesn't appeal to you. What he meant was very similar to, so it goes back to that principle of discernment. It's like a musical instrument. If you if you learn a musical instrument, it takes an enormous amount of practice just to be able to um, just to be able to start playing fundamental songs on an instrument. And and unless you really put the time into a practice, which you don't know if it resonates with you because it may just simply be that you're not adept enough at that particular practice to be able to make use of it yet. So what happens is that kids stop working, and as well as adults, they stop practicing. Um, let's say there's a particular approach to anything that you want to learn, and there are multiple approaches to that task. What he was saying is you have to completely and fully give yourself to that 100% and master it, and then do the same for the other approaches. Then you have the ability to discern what is most appropriate for you individually because then you actually know the application of it. But to try something because it's hard, just give it up and then attribute that to, oh, well, it's just, I'm just disregarding what's useless because it's useless. No, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's useless. It just means that, you may not have figured it out yet. And you have to put the adequate amount of time and practice into that. So, like a piece of music, that's what Bruce Lee and Sifu Fran actually likens it to very frequently. Is you have a certain amount of notes, you have a way that a piece of music is written. The way in which that's interpreted by each individual can be extremely varied, and it doesn't make it right or make it wrong. It just means that it's different. And the degree to which one develops virtuosity in that expression, that is really the key factor when it comes to being able to sort of shape and form that type of creative expression. And that's where the artistic element begins to come into play. So, and that's what I've spent my time doing, particularly at UCLA, is taking this world of art, of artistic expression, and then integrating that with science.
I really appreciate you clarifying that and putting an emphasis on it because it also applies to mindfulness. which is a practice as well. And that's what I want to ask you about next, because there is a real concerted effort to bring mindfulness practices to the schools in various different ways. But what I've noticed over my experience in being in different school districts, different grade levels, the intent is there. Um, but it oftentimes it's really lacking the real depth, and it's diluted to the point that it does not transfer into any activity during the school day or beyond the school day. So I really want to ask you, coming from where you sit, how do you describe what mindfulness actually asks of a person when it's practiced with real integrity?
Well, that is a wonderfully astute observation, and that mirrors my experience as well, because I've gone around this community and taught a 6 weeks mindfulness course to teachers in the local community in an attempt to orient them to being able to do this in the classroom. And it was based on the MAPS, it was sort of a
Mhm.
condensed version of the MAPS curriculum, and from UCLA. And it comes down to buy-in. It
Mm.
absolutely comes down to buy-in. And that basically means every individual who is purported to teach mindfulness has to be a practitioner. There's no other way to do it. So if I hand you a sheet that says read these 5 points for a kid to do in class, or anyone for that matter, of course it's going to ring disingenuous because, and that's the problem that I've encountered with being able to teach at different schools, because the teachers are worn out. It's just one more thing that comes down the pipeline of stuff that we have to implement in the classroom. Oh, great, here's another something that I have to learn and roll out to my class. Well, I don't have enough time to just read, I don't have enough time to grade papers, and I don't have enough assistance in class to deal with the 5 ADHD spinners that are, drawing all the attention in class. So, um, so it comes down to each individual making the commitment to themselves that they simply have to take, even if it's a few minutes a day, just to sit in stillness by themselves and become aware and notice how that changes their perspective, how it changes their life individually. And then you have the ability to convey that to somebody else. But just reading it from a sheet, there's a depth of understanding that comes from one's own practice, and you know this from being a yoga teacher, and and again, the various incarnations of these mindfulness-based practices. Again, it doesn't matter. It's like, which musical instrument. It doesn't matter. It's just a question of the practice that allows you to reach that level of virtuosity. And there are, varying levels in between. But the main thing is that, are you on the journey? If you're on the journey, you've committed to the journey, then you feel a desire to share that journey with others. And that's how you get over the hump, with being able to take a kid and help them move through these obstacles, rather than just being constantly exasperated and, get them out of my classroom, get out of my classroom. Um, uh, the solution is not just throwing every kid that's got a problem into a special needs class.
Mhm.
It has to do with really, oh gosh, it's so multifaceted. There are so many contributing factors, but it starts with that person. I mean, I really do feel that most teachers, in my experience, have a calling to teach.
Mhm.
I really don't think it's just, well, I guess I'll do this because I think it looks easy. I mean, I don't think anybody wants that. Most people go into um, education, particularly early childhood education, because they really have a desire to alter the perspective of young people because the kids are going to become our society later.
Mhm.
So so then that kind of comes back to that same principle of the parents, right? What am I housing in here in terms of my experience that may be tainting my ability to convey the best information to the kids? What perspective am I holding from my own past experience? What
Mhm.
what dysfunction, what perspective is not allowing me is what am I passing on to the kids that if it were my kid I wouldn't want to pass it on to them? And that requires self-analysis. It requires discernment, evaluation, not criticism, but evaluation, self-reflection. And self-reflection is one of the cornerstones of mindfulness practice. But it's uncomfortable. You know,
Very.
you look at your own stuff, that's hard because sometimes it's not particularly appealing because that means you
Mhm.
got to do something about it.
Mhm. Yeah. All that unexamined inheritance that we pass down without ever questioning it because it is the norm, right? That's what everybody does. That's how we were brought up or educated. And really creating that buy-in is the biggest challenge I find because I remember you brought mindfulness program, and I think it was 8 weeks at the time when I was a principal here in Santa Clarita. And it was volunteer based. People missed classes, but even if they participated part-time,
Hmm.
they saw significant difference in the way they feel, how they manage their time, their stress levels, their relationship with the spouse, the kids, and then it slowly started trickling down into the classrooms. And so I can't agree with you more that it starts with the self and that you need to sit with the discomfort long enough to actually see the transformation. And
Hmm.
then once you've experienced it yourself, you can't not share it with others. That's because you want others to get those benefits, especially if those are the students that you're responsible for. But I think just creating that crack and just creating that initial buy-in for people just to try and try it long enough to reap the benefits, that's where I personally get stuck all the time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah,
Mhm.
you just have to do it. It's one of those things you can't read about it. You have to simply practice. You read all the books you want, but it's like, reading a book on how to swim.
Mhm.
You
You'll
eventually,
never learn.
eventually you have to dive in the water. And that's about the only way to do it.
Yes. And you've dedicated decades researching the effects of movement-based awareness training on children and adults diagnosed with ADHD and ADD. So I'm really curious, what drew you specifically to this population and what you've observed that the therapeutic approaches were missing and what you were offering was actually addressing the problem at the core level?
We've expanded that, particularly with ASD populations now, the
Mm,
autism spectrum disorder. And we're finding that across the boundary of concomitant disorders, that body-based learning creates a bridge into an intellectual understanding of modified behavior perspectives. So most therapeutic environments revolve around the idea of discussion, and then through discussion, um, coming to awareness of some sort of pathology and um, or some sort of incident that has triggered an emotional response, and then building a pathway toward um, uh, new response mechanisms that can be viewed as a more healthy response to the stimulus, a way to express whatever it is. There's a lot of work in somatic healing and learning where we store emotional states in our body, and we store emotion that we don't even know is there. And I used to experience this. I worked with a number of psychologists and psychiatrists who were dealing with trauma victims, particularly sexual abuse and rape. And they would work with me so that the patients could have a physical conduit to be able to safely get out what was pent up and held inside their bodies. And then as that was accessed through the body-based learning, then they could process emotionally and verbally and intellectually what was occurring, and they could begin to give it a voice. That's the fundamental principle. And when you think about kinesthetic learning, our core awareness of the world initially comes from our relation to what is in our space because of our body. You know, we roll as infants, we crawl, we put everything in our mouth. You know, we're exploring textures and feelings and temperatures, and all of this we learn from our body. And we become or have become increasingly disconnected from our body. As we continue to evolve as a society and we continue to develop technology that enables us to sort of depart from the physical labor that was previously necessary in prior generations for survival. Do you remember a Disney movie called Wall-E?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where everyone basically, everything is completely automated and all people do is just get fat and float around on chairs, right? Well,
We're headed in that direction.
yeah, that's not too far afield from where we're going. And so the reason part of the reason that I initially got into this was based on my experience, because when I was a kid, the conditions that I recognize now that I held, there was no diagnosable category for that. Yeah. With me, I recognize now I was ADHD, Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. You know, all of those were classic characteristics that you could read it like a book on me if you were to diagnose it today. And there was no means by which one at that time in the late 60s and the early 70s that you could, you know, there was no diagnostic category for it, nor was there any treatment. It was just smack that kid and, you know, set him straight. But more than that, it was the enormous amount of fear and anxiety that I felt. And in just pure social interactions, right? Just not feeling connected or a part of anything and having no tools to be able to express anything that I was experiencing. And I found that the one source of relief, I found two primary sources of relief: drugs and alcohol, to basically numb it and anesthetize myself. And then two was physicality in whatever form that took. And so as time went on, I recognized, I was fortunate enough in my early 20s to get rid of the alcohol and the addictive characteristics, but then I was still left with the emotional state. And the physicality was always something, and particularly with martial arts, because the martial arts, inherent in its practice in more of a classical context, it's blended and merged with mindfulness. And that gave me an enormous amount of relief. So fast forward a number of years, my eldest son was diagnosed with all the stuff that I had. He had he had he was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome with very pronounced motor and vocal tics. So when he would sit in class, he had absolutely no control over what was happening with the sounds and the movements. And the kids just, when they're that age, they're just brutal when it comes to any kid that's outside of the societal norm. So they berated him and teased him and bullied him, and so I said I've got to find something for my kid, and so I started. His pediatrician had recommended clonidine, which is an adult hypertension med, and it basically sort of zones you out. And I said, well, I don't want that for my kid. And I said, what is the long-term impacts of this type of medication on a child? Oh, it won't hurt him. And so I went this was pre-internet, so I went to the medical library at UCLA and I dug around and I found that there was no evidence whatsoever of long-term impact of this particular type of medication on kids. So I said, no, I'm not comfortable doing that. I'm not going to stick him on something that just has that we have no idea. We know it dumbs him down, but we don't know what the long-term impact is going to be. And was I the pariah, holy cow. I remember sitting in the office with my ex-wife, the teacher, and the principal and the school psychologist, and they looked at me like I was the ultimate idiot. What's the matter with you? Don't you want to help your child? And I said, yeah, I do, but I don't want to do it this way. So give me a little bit of time. So I took him to UCLA. I took him to multiple studies. We practiced mindfulness. We did martial arts. And ultimately, what I found that worked the best for him individually, I knew an acupuncturist from Shanghai who had treated her nephew with similar symptoms, and she said, well, try a few sessions and you'll know. No harm done. So I bribed my kid $10 a session and took him down to West LA, and she put the needles in, and after 5 sessions his symptoms decreased by 95%. Truly remarkable. And then that was added to the mindfulness practice, which he didn't like, by the way. He didn't like, I had him go through sort of a routine at night where he would practice mindfulness, but it was more of a guided meditation that I had recorded for him. And he didn't like doing any of that stuff, but it ultimately got him through school. And that's where I started working with different population segments, different groups. About that same time, I was asked to join the UCLA Mind-Body Faculty Committee. And the objective of that particular committee was to take a look at different forms of research that were taking place on UCLA's campus and not replicate it. And then look what was happening in the North Campus in the arts and architecture, and then the School of Education and Information Studies, and then look at what was occurring on South Campus. And with me, I met Sue Smalley and Diana Winston and Dan Siegel when they were first forming MARC, the Mindful Awareness Research Center, in 2005. And so, and then they introduced me to a guy named Siggy Hale, who was a PhD in neuroscience. And Siggy happened to be a martial arts guy, and he also happened to be a mindfulness practitioner. So we did a bunch of work together in developing these programs that integrated kinesthetic learning with mindfulness practice and cognitive learning therapies. And It's basically a bunch of cognitive learning therapy drills that are hidden inside martial arts. And kids don't know any different. They just are doing games as far as they know. But it's all designed to improve visual tracking because we took exercises from visual tracking exercises, which a lot of ADHD kids, their eyes jump when they're trying to read. So it's difficult for them to maintain a through line of thought and difficult to retain information because imagine your eyes are bouncing all over the page. And there's visual tracking therapy that's very specific for that. But we just borrowed some of that and we integrated it into the kinesthetic learning world. And so anyway, I don't want to go on too long about it, but that's kind of that's really what led me to that path and led me to that development. And then it was the integration of the creative movement that I do in the Department of Theater at UCLA with the um, with the science base, the world of neuroscience and the science that comes out of that, and kind of integrating those together. And then most recently, working with the Peers Clinic, which is a UCLA autism treatment clinic that's designed to teach how to form friendships and bonds. So we've integrated all that together, and now we're doing that here with a neurodivergent program where we're working with we're vendored with the Northern Regional Center so that parents who have kids that are on the autism spectrum can come in. And we have three tiers for it. One is we start kids with private lessons, depending on their diagnostic category, if they're level 1, 2, or 3. And then we'll work with them individually so that they can acclimate. And then we have small groups that are using the peers curriculum, but it's peers is generally designed to be taught around a table, right? And with play therapy with kids that are preschool or grade school. But what we've done is we've integrated the MBAT, which is the movement-based awareness program that I created, and we've integrated that with the peers curriculum for small groups of 4 to 6, so we can take kids that are on the spectrum, still use the evidence-based curriculum from peers, but integrate it with the physical learning, and then take them and move them into the integrated classes with the general population, just like you would want to do in school, right? So what we're trying to do is create a mirror for that, except it's not designated as a special ed class, and and most of the IEPs for schools are based on it's always looking at it's always rooted in what kind of grade are they getting? Can we
Mhm.
get them through the system? Not how is this person integrated? So,
Mhm.
so that's where we look at with the individual lessons, how we can start to help them, the dyspraxia, understanding movement more effectively and how they connect with their bodies. And then integration socially with other kids that are going through the same thing, and then pushing them into the gen ed groups where they're able to function side by side by like with everybody else, but without judgment. That's the important thing because we can control the environment here.
That is absolutely fascinating. And there's so many things that I want to respond, like comment on, but I'll just say one thing. Thank you for sharing the story of your son. And I can completely understand you as a parent because I found myself in similar situation multiple times, not as a parent, but as an administrator sitting on those IEP meetings. And my heart would sink every time there was a conversation around kids being prescribed adult hypertension medications. And there's so many kids even now on Ritalin and many other things because the goal is to get them to perform to some arbitrary standard, really disregarding the rest of their neurophysiological needs
Mhm.
and really finding that unique, fully personalized approach to the wholeness of the human in front of them and really serving that rather than some arbitrary standards. And so being within the system to represent the system, I oftentimes felt like I was working against the system, trying
Mm,
to do what's best for the child. And because I would approach after the meeting the parent and say, have you looked for other modalities? Have you tried acupuncture and many other things before you consider Ritalin? Right. And that wasn't my place to do it. And so no wonder that I had to leave the system and do what I was always called to do. So thank you so much for sharing it. You created something absolutely unicorn,
mm,
and your center is called Ekata, which
Ekata.
means oneness. Am I saying it correctly?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm really curious what Ekata means to you, not as a philosophical concept, Ed, but as something a student can actually arrive at through training, and what it looks like. What does it look like when they do arrive?
Well, first off, the name was actually suggested by a very dear friend of ours named Derek Lin, who is a Taoist teacher and author, has a wonderful series of books on one, a translation of the Tao Te Ching and the Tao of Happiness. He has a variety of books out that are just terrific because he's a native Chinese speaker and English speaker, very unique and understands classical Chinese. So his interpretations and translations are very unique in that world. But Derek and I had been friends for 20 years, and um, he was the one who suggested Ekata when we were beginning the place. And um, and the Sanskrit, it's a Sanskrit term which means unity or oneness. And on a on a superficial level, it well, not necessarily superficial, but it means the unity between mind and body. But the broader meaning really goes back to the fundamental principle that's expressed in Buddhist literature about awakening, enlightenment. And the difficulty with that is that there is no true apt description of that state that can be projected using words. Um, it's a it's an experience that comes through reflection, observation, and and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to adhere to or subscribe to any particular philosophy, like being Buddhist. I'm personally Christian,
Mm.
um, but it doesn't mean that we can't learn from other um, philosophies and culture, and we can't embrace and embody that in our own practice. When you figure that the depth and breadth of human experience is quite broad, it stands the reason that we can stand on the backs of those who came before us and take advantage of what they've learned. If we're if we're humble enough to accept the lessons. And that's one of the key components when it comes to martial arts is this principle of humility and showing respect. When you do that and are truly open, emptying your cup, emptying your vessel, it allows for the universe to be able to give you a glimpse of how it all fits together. And we've all had those glimpses, but we don't recognize it sometimes. Those times when you feel you just all of a sudden recognize that everything is exactly as it should be. And they come and go like the wind, but these moments of awakening, of a light enlightenment, it's called satori in Japanese, and um, and that's truly the essence of it. It's what my aspiration is to bring this to families so that families can fully embrace it. And you and I have talked about this many times. The biggest difficulty in being able to help kids is being able to help their parents because they have to simply recognize where the behavior comes from. It's generational. So what you're experiencing with your kid may partially be genetic, it may be partially their lot in life, just what they've received from God, but they also have significantly been impacted by environmental conditioning. So the way that we confer information is through example, it's through direct teaching, but bottom line is, we as adults are the ones who formulate the structure of our children's behavior and their personalities. And when parents are simply tuned out and they're not aware of that impact and influence, that's when you have the parent who's like, just fix my kid, man. I don't know what's the matter with him. And that's because you are unaware. That's what's wrong. And if we can begin to, that's why we created this to be a family center, right? We want adults to be able to participate in some way. We don't want them to just sit on the sidelines scrolling on their phone, while their kid does classes. Although, there's a lot of people who still do that. But at least we're trying to get that type of engagement so that we get a shared perspective. Um, so unity says a lot with respect to our world at large, and the divisiveness that we see. And it's truly stunning to me that we can't disagree but not be enormously hostile toward one another. Um, and that would be the ideal, I think, is to still be able to disagree on any major life path, but actually listen and try to appreciate and understand someone else's perspective. I found that one of the most pivotal exercises that we use in the world of mindfulness, and this is um, Marvin Belzer from the Mindful Awareness Research Center. He used to love doing these exercises. Am I saying his name right? I hope I am. But he used to be the one who led all of the relational exercises, the relational mindfulness exercises. And they are incredibly useful because you can sit across from somebody and in 5 minutes know more about that individual and relate and connect to them more than you would in 5 years of sitting in the next cubicle. And I think that type of work is absolutely crucial in being able to create a society that doesn't implode on itself. That to where we don't have to just destroy one another because we don't view things from the same perspective. And we can actually learn something from other people and maybe consider their perspective. And again, we may disagree with it, but it doesn't mean. Listen, man, in my past life, I figured out really fast the best way to get rid of fear when somebody is in your face is to punch them in the face. And so I did a lot of punching people in the face when I was younger. And um, and abating fear in that way is never a good solution because it generates more conflict, more resentment, more hostility, and it grows. Conversely, when you when you actually listen to somebody and you repeat back to them what you're hearing. And you can leave that person and just say, well, thank you for sharing your perspective. I really appreciate that. And I think I do see where you're coming from. I don't really agree with it, but thank you for sharing it. And then you can just walk away agreeing to disagree. Man, think about how much more effective we would be in the world if we were able to do that, without having to freaking shoot each other
Mm.
and everything that comes with that. So, and listen, man, I learned this stuff from conflict. I didn't learn it because I read it out of a book. I learned it because I was in it. And that violence was part of my life. And I didn't want it anymore. And so I had to figure out a way to stop. And and that's what martial arts has been able to provide for me. It's been able to provide a way in which I can structure that, and I can guide that and utilize that energy in a way that is safe and appropriate, rather than creating more conflict.
Thank you so much for beautifully responding to the question that I asked and to the next question that I was about to ask, because I was going to ask you, what is the essence and what is it that you want your students who were with you, I don't know, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years ago, what do you want them to embody and pass on, which is probably beyond the technique, the martial arts technique over time. Oftentimes, it's what is the essence? And you just beautifully answered that question. So thank you so much, Ed. I want to ask you the last traditional potentiality question, which is usually about the large scale impact of the topic that we're discussing. So, if the practice of moving with awareness, of learning to regulate from within and find stillness inside effort, were to become the foundation of how we raise and educate every child, what becomes possible for humanity that is not possible now?
Well, I think it goes back to exactly what I was talking about.
Mhm.
um, it's resolution of conflict. We talk about all the time, how do you make the world better? How do you make it a better place? And it starts with kids. It starts with kids, because they will be holding the world for us as we continue to age. And you have to get them early. You have to start really early in those formative stages, because that's what shapes and forms their personality. So, what becomes possible? It becomes possible to have strength. It becomes possible to have empathy. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. You don't have to let people roll over you and become a doormat just simply because you're aware and you're kind. You can still have strength and boundaries and hold them. And I think that's um, one of the um, one of the primary concerns of a great many people who um, who observe what's typically termed woke culture, and that there is this complete disengagement from any sense of personal responsibility, and um, that it's letting the tail wag the dog. And 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 I don't think that's what the intent of simply building awareness. That whole movement was about not being deadened, and not being just simply not being aware,
Mhm.
because the converse is also true. You can see those who have no sense of awareness, who berate and step on other people because their orientation is all generated towards self. And and um, so there are polar extremes, and that's the fundamental principle of yin and yang.
Mhm.
So it's always a balance. It's always something that comes in the middle. And and that's where I think this can really teach us, because this basic principle of the Tai Chi, which is this, that's what that is originally. Yeah, it's the balance, the complementary balance of opposites. That's what holds our world and creates a sense of unity. So if we could all just simply build awareness, we could, through movement, it allows us to keep this spacesuit in a workable condition for an extended period of time. And that becomes a life practice. If you integrate that with the philosophical component, the mindfulness element, then you're building awareness, but you're also doing something that's going to help preserve this experience of the body. And we generally know that when people don't care for their bodies, it makes a miserable experience.
Mhm.
We tend to not enjoy our life, which taints our perspective, which impacts our attitude. So we're going to view things from a negative perspective. And then with those without awareness will sort of um, they'll cast that out by attacking others, share the misery.
Mhm.
So that can be abated through awareness, communication, and through caring for ourselves. And if you take a generation of kids that are on stupid screens, they don't want to move. They don't want to move. They need to move. That's we are designed to move. For thousands of years, we had to create our own food sources. We had to go plow the fields and milk the cows and do all this stuff to keep ourselves alive. That's all physical activity. Now if we go to the world of Wally and we just sit on our butts and have everything done for us, man, that's going to create quite a conundrum when it comes to just our
Mhm.
ability to express our body. So I think kind of the short version of it, even though I've talked for a long time, I think the short version of it is being able to find mind-body balance, and then relationally the same principle with other people who may not necessarily be walking our path.
So beautiful, all of it. It's really about balance and equilibrium. Life is, creation is. That's why yin and yang is the foundational principle. And it really stood out when you said strength and empathy. I call it soft power. And I
Mm,
think that's really the essence of leadership, starting with self-leadership. We just need more leaders like that.
mm, agreed, agreed.
Thank you so much, Ed. Every intellectual exchange with you, and we've had many over the years, is absolutely fascinating, insightful, very deep, and creates lots of opportunity for reflection for me later on. But I really want to stop here and ask you to maybe share some resources. Where can our audience find you if they want to learn more about Ekata Center, the sources, actually the services that you offer? Where can they find you?
So the easiest place is probably our website, which is ekata.net, ekata.net. You can reach out to me there or via email, sifued@gmail.com. So Sifu means teacher. So it actually means the father who has come before, but that's a teaching title that is bestowed to males and females alike when it comes to the world of Kung Fu. And it's so if you ever saw Kung Fu Panda, Master Shifu. So that's the Mandarin pronunciation of the same term. So Sifu with a hard S is Cantonese. And because of Bruce Lee coming from the area around Hong Kong, that's why it's pronounced that way. And also with the Southern Chinese style Wing Chun, that's so Sifu. So Sifu, Sifued at gmail.com.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources. We will include all of that in the description box below this video. Ed, I can't thank you enough for the generosity, the depth, the wisdom of lived experience that you shared today with our audience. I am truly, truly humbled by your presence on Potentiality. Is there anything that you would like to share that I did not ask you about?
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that, Elena. But I have to also mirror your comment as well. I've always enjoyed speaking with you and really have a great appreciation for your desire to improve the quality of the world and admire what you've done in terms of stepping away from the traditional model of education to create your own model that embodies the essence of really this conversation. And I think it's going to just create, there's so much potential with that. And I think that's a real, gosh, we just need to connect the dots with more of us who are doing this kind of work. And there are a lot of people out there that feel this way, and it's bringing it to the masses. That's the key, just more education, more awareness, just keep it growing. You can grow hostility, but it goes the other way too.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Ed. Everything is received with deep gratitude. I keep envisioning the day what you do, what I do, and people like us do will become the critical mass, and we will ultimately shift what we see happening on the global scale. Thank you so much for being with us on Potentiality today. It's really, really valuable, not only for me, for the audience, but I think this will stay on the channel, and everybody who finds this video will hopefully start seeing things in a completely different light.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us today. I am grateful for each one of you tuning into today's episode, and I sincerely hope you found it insightful and valuable. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet to never miss an episode. I will see you next time.